All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you taking your lunchtime to join us. And this is our first quarterly roundtable of 2026, so we're glad to see you here. And especially to talk about this important topic that we have about going concern and liquidity and what boards and leaders need to know. So if you're new to Han Group, welcome. And we are a public accounting firm that's solely focused on nonprofits. And we're happy to have you all here today as part of our nonprofit community. So please feel free to ask questions through the chat and join in the conversation. Alexi has just uploaded our PowerPoint presentation today in case anybody wants to follow along. You're welcome to. And we've been talking a lot in the roundtable discussions over the past year about navigating uncertainty. And these concepts today that we'll talk about, liquidity, reserves, going concern, they all go hand in hand with those strategies. So we'd love to address any questions and hear any real life examples throughout the session. So if you want to talk, please just chime in, let us know. And thanks to those of you who sent in questions in advance. Those are always nice to get, and we'll be sure to address them throughout the presentation. And if there are any accountants joining us today, this webinar does qualify for one CPE credit. You must answer at least 3 polling questions throughout the presentation and complete the survey at the end. So please leave your browser open after the session ends. And everyone's welcome and encouraged to participate, even if you don't need the CPE. All right, so we will get started. If you've attended a Han Group webinar or roundtable recently, you probably already know that I'm Heather Johnson, an accounting and advisory partner. And in addition to facilitating these sessions, I'm honored to serve as a trusted strategic partner to my clients, helping them to strengthen their financial operations, implement best practices, and navigate uncertainty with clarity and confidence. In today's session, I'll be representing the accounting side of understanding liquidity and reserves. And I am thrilled to have David Nazari join us today to represent the auditor's viewpoint. David?
Hi, everybody. I'm David Nazari, Senior Audit Manager at the Han Group, and I've spent my entire career in public accounting focusing on the nonprofit sector. So I'm happy to discuss some of the audit perspective and discuss going concern today.
Great. So in today's session, David and I will be addressing what liquidity and reserves actually mean, what a healthy organization looks like, what triggers a going concern discussion, and what you can do now to stay ahead of it. For many of my clients, we review financial information on a monthly basis, and I will say that's best practice. I highly recommend that. Sometimes we even look weekly at cash flow, if cash flow is a concern. In addition to preparing the actual financial statements, a lot of times we'll prepare a dashboard to show a snapshot of key pieces of information to share. And we found this to be really helpful when presenting to boards to show them the information that they need to focus on in, and these are two of the main areas, liquidity and reserves. And liquidity is the cash or near cash assets that you have available now to pay bills. Some organizations have a strong looking balance sheet because they own a building, but that doesn't mean much if you can't pay payroll. So liquidity is about how you're doing right now. Can you pay your bills? Reserves are about planning what you've set aside intentionally. You can have reserves on paper, but not have access to the cash. So that's why it's important to look at both of the metrics together. People like to ask what their reserves should be. That's a very common question that we get. And we do give kind of a standard answer to say, oh, probably 3 to 6 months of expenses in a stable environment, or now more like 6 to 12 months of expenses in turbulent times. But it's really not a one size fits all number, which I'm sure David agrees with. Um, you need to consider your revenue and expense cycles and also your strategic plan. So, if you're a new organization just starting out, you're probably building up to that 3 to 6 month mark. But if you're well established, you should be considering what your 5 and 10 year goals look like, as well as, what's happening in the current climate that's affecting your organization. When I meet with management and the board, I like to look at three key pieces of information. So, one is operating reserves. This is your organization's financial safety net. It's what keeps things running if revenue is delayed, expenses increase, or something unexpected happens. We also look at your current ratio, what you have available soon compared to what you owe soon. So, can we pay our bills over the next 12 months with what we currently have? And we also like to look at days cash on hand, especially if you are in a weaker cash position. So, how many days can your organization continue operating using only its available cash or near cash assets? On this screen, whoops. I think I'm sorry about that. Okay. On, let's see. So on this screen is an example of a dashboard that we might review with management or the board. As you can see, we have a statement of financial position on the left showing assets, liabilities, and net assets. So, what does this mean? How does a board member that's not deep into the financial information know if this is a healthy outcome or if there are signs to be concerned about? There are a few indicators off the bat. So, we have cash right here, so that's good, obviously. But is it enough? And our assets, they're bigger than our liabilities. That's always a good sign. We do have unrestricted net assets, which is a good sign too. But again, what's enough to feel comfortable and to be sustainable? That's where the liquidity and reserve metrics come into play. They're just another piece of information to help make informed decisions. So here in this example, we're showing a current ratio, um, operating reserve ratio, and days cash on hand. And I like to include not only the results, but also the benchmarks. So you can see I have the results highlighted here. So our current ratio in this situation is 1.73, and we're saying that the ideal range should be 1.5 to 3. And what this is saying is we have enough cash to cover all of our current liabilities plus some extra. Our operating reserves, we're at 0.30 right now, which is a little bit over 3 months. So we like to see our benchmarks, for that 3 to 6 month range that I was talking about is 0.25 to zero point 0.5, or 6 to 12 months, even better, would be zero point 0.5 to 1. And then days cash on hand, we're at 87 days. So it's almost that 90-day mark. So I would consider these within range, but they're at the lower end of that range. And so I might look at these and say, this might be kind of a yellow flag warning. Like you're okay, everything's in range. I would also like to see how these numbers compare to prior period and what our projections are for future period too. This is just a snapshot on this day, and really just looking at these metrics for one day doesn't give us all the information that we need, but it is definitely a helpful component. I do see a hand raised. So, Joanne?
Hi, thanks. I'm just curious about that last indicator, the days cash on hand. Does that sort of 90 plus day mark change depending on the size of the organization? As an example, I would think that for organizations over a certain budget size or even certain staff size, that 90 days might still feel a little tight.
Yeah, that is a good question. I will say, and when we say 90 days, we are looking at your annual operating costs. So it goes by that. So if you're a smaller organization, obviously your annual costs are probably smaller than a large organization. And these are kind of the metrics that and the benchmarks that we've come up with, but you bring up a great point that it needs to feel good to your organization. So if you know that you have a lot of one-off expenses, it's not really, truly just annualized over the year, then you're right. You may want to have 180 days of cash on hand to cover those type of one-off situations. Okay. Um, Great. And the only other thing that I wanted to add to this is just definitely, Joanne brought up such a good point to make sure that these feel comfortable for your organization and then also continue to look at them over a period of time. So if you get here and we're like, okay, we're meeting the benchmarks, but they're a little bit, they're towards the bottom of the benchmark, keep reviewing, keep seeing where you are because really what we want to know is what is the trajectory? Are you continuing to decrease? And that may be a sign of a bigger issue. Or was this kind of a blip and you're building up, which shows that you're probably doing okay. And so we do have some early warning signs here too. So as you, management, and your board review your financial statements, you want to keep an eye out for the early warning signs of distress, like we were talking about. So not only the metrics that we just mentioned, but there could be declining unrestricted net assets, negative cash flow, which means that you have to sell or borrow to fund. And I'm sorry, we do have a polling question. So, which of these areas is most relevant to you right now? I'll just finish this slide though. So, uh, the growing payables and unexpected variances between your budget. So that's an important thing to keep looking at too. And that's actually one of the biggest tools that I use when talking to a board. Boards really know their budgets because they had to approve them. So looking at those variances between revenue and expenses for budget is a good tool to use. And we want to make sure that you're looking at this information on a regular basis and not just waiting until your year-end audit. Sorry, David. All right, so it looks like polling question. It looks like people are saying that the biggest concern right now is liquidity, which makes sense. You need to have cash on hand to pay the bills. Okay, great. Whoops. And finally, just to kind of round this up, and the reason why I'm talking first is I know a lot of you are here to hear about going concern. These are definitely pieces that make up that going concern consideration. Um, and then just some tools in order to make sure that your organization is mitigating its risk. These are things that we've been talking about over the last year with all of our Navigating Uncertainty series, talking about what you can be doing. And it all flows into, developing your board policies. Of course, you should have a reserve policy as well as other policies. We talked a lot about just that board education and getting the boards more involved, more used to looking at your financials on a regular basis. I know our auditors really like to talk about diversifying revenue sources. And, last year we saw firsthand why that was so important because um, of the federal funding shutdown. So our organizations that relied a lot on federal funding, they absolutely were scrambling to try to diversify revenue. And then building that rolling cash flow forecast, especially if liquidity is a concern. I have clients where we update the cash flow every week. A lot of them, I think really ideally it's to do it by pay period because normally your pay period is your biggest cash outlay. But some of them we even do it every week just to make sure that we're going to be able to pay bills. And it also makes for nice scenario planning because you can pretty easily see, okay, well, if I don't get this grant that I'm expecting on this date, how is that going to impact my payment of expenses? and then having the written contingency plan. And that's the scenario planning that we've talked about a lot too. So coming up with those triggers, what will happen if I don't get this big grant? Or it could even be positive news. It could be, what do we do if we get, a new unexpected grant? Then maybe we have a new program, or maybe we hire additional staff. So hopefully this is a good checklist for you. And now that we've talked about the highlights of the reserves, the liquidity, and what you should be looking at on a regular basis, I'm going to hand it over to David to demystify what auditors review. David?
Sure. Thanks, Heather. So I'm really glad we started with liquidity and reserves because that's really a huge component of going concern. And in practice, whenever there are going concern issues, it can usually always get tied back to cash flow challenges and limited reserves. And one of the biggest misconceptions is what a going concern is. So a lot of people think that that means your organization's failing or it's not going to be around. And that's not what a going concern is. It's not predicting the future, but it's really about identifying and evaluating uncertainty. And it's really become a hot topic as of late because organizations are under more financial pressure. So it could be inflation, changes to the economy, lost significant funding. So it's becoming more of an issue now. And what is a going concern? Going concern means that the organization's expected to be in operations for the foreseeable future. And every audit requires an assessment of going concern. And that's a forward-looking assessment of financial sustainability. And you're looking 12 months from the date of the financial statement issuance. So for example, if you're December 31st, 2025 year end, your audit's getting issued March 31st, 2026. Your evaluation period for the going concern is going to be April 1st, 2026, all the way to March 31st, 2027. So that's something people mix up quite a bit. They think that it's 12 months from your financial statement date, but it's actually when you issue those financial statements. And one important thing to note here is that it's not just a auditor exercise, it's required by management. So if management's doing all the things that Heather just mentioned with the forecasting, doing some of that liquidity analysis, then they've essentially already done their assessment and they're ready for the audit. So that's another just reason to highlight the importance of doing those recommendations that Heather was talking about. So now let's look at what drives the evaluation. So basically your evaluation's trying to answer one question: do conditions exist that raise substantial doubt? And then we're going to answer that question through various indicators, and they usually fall into three buckets: financial, operational, and other. In my experience, one of the biggest indicators that raises substantial doubt is going to be negative or really low net assets without donor restrictions. And that basically just signals that there's not a lot of cushion for disruptions. Another major indicator is liquidity issues. So if you're an organization that's kind of relying on the timing of grants to stay afloat, or maybe you're relying on your line of credit to pay your payroll obligations, well, those are going to be significant indicators. And then more recently, we saw, lost funding was a major indicator. So any of those organizations that were relying on government grants as a significant revenue source, those got canceled. Well, now they have some substantial doubt. And I do want to emphasize that it's usually not just one indicator. It's a combination of indicators that raises substantial doubt. So for example, let's say you lost funding, but you have really strong reserves. Well, the combination of those indicators may not raise substantial doubt, but if you combine lost funding with limited cash flow or liquidity challenges, well, now you're most likely going to have some substantial doubt.
And David, we did have a question that was sent in advance asking about subsequent activities. And so what they want to know is, do activities that happen after year end factor into your going concern consideration?
Yeah, that's a great question. So absolutely they do. So remember that the evaluation period's 12 months from your financial statement issuance. So even events that happen after year end affect your current audit. So, 2026 events could affect your 2025 financial statements if you haven't issued your audit yet. Absolutely.
Thank you.
So we've talked about you've gone through your required going concern analysis. Now you've identified that there's conditions about raising substantial doubt. What happens next? So the next step is management has to develop a plan. We'll talk a little bit about what that plan looks like. And then after management develops a plan, the auditor comes in and evaluates that plan. So we're going to audit that plan and ask the question, does this really alleviate the substantial doubt? And then based on that evaluation, there's going to be implications to the financial statements.
I will say, as I work with my clients to close their year end, we're always asking ourselves, we're always saying, what questions are the auditors going to have? So I recommend everybody do that. And this next point I think was great.
So what 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 creates a credible plan? So it's got to have three components. It's got to be specific, measurable, and supported by documentation. And it can't be vague. So for example, if you have a cost reduction plan, your plan can't just say we're going to cut costs. It has to be specific actions that have dollar results that can be audited. So really specific actions that can take place and produce results. A pretty common plan usually is revenue enhancement. So that can't just be aspirational fundraising. It's got to be signed agreements with specific dollar amounts. One other really common plan that alleviates doubt would be financing arrangements. So getting new loans or even just restructuring your loans. But once again, those have to be approved, documented loans. They can't just be um, aspirational. And from an auditor's perspective, the difference between a strong plan that alleviates substantial doubt and a weak plan that doesn't, it really comes down to evidence. Do you have documentation to support your plan?
And so that cash flow projection that we were talking about, would that go hand in hand with this remediation plan?
So the cash flow, that's normally going to be kind of part of your initial assessment and going to give you those indicators, but then your plan is kind of how you address that doubt. What steps can you take to get out of the hole per se?
Okay.
So you've gone through the evaluation, you've created your plan, the auditor evaluated it. So how does that have an implication on your financial statements? And this is a common misconception. So I think a lot of people think that a going concern adjusts the audit opinion, and it does not. Depending on the outcome, it will adjust your financial statement disclosures. So there's really three possible outcomes. The first outcome, this is what we're going to see on almost every audit. You did your required assessment. There's no indicators identified, so you just report your financial statements as normal. And then the next tier of outcomes would be that you did your analysis, you identified that there were some indicators, but you have a plan in place that alleviated that substantial doubt. So what's the result of that? Well, you have to add a disclosure to your financial statements. And that disclosure is going to basically communicate what the indicators were and what the plan was. And you're able to conclude in that footnote that, hey, we had some issues, but we've alleviated them, we've addressed them. And then, so an example of that may be, you had some revenue shortfalls, you're having some cash constraints, but then after year end, you signed a nice multi-year agreement. You can basically kind of communicate that, you've received funding to alleviate the doubt. And then the third tier is that you did your evaluation, you identified some substantial doubt, and it hasn't been alleviated. So in that instance, that's going to be the most severe, where you're going to have a disclosure, and that disclosure explicitly has to state, hey, there's still uncertainty that remains. This hasn't been alleviated. And then in addition to the disclosure, your audit report's going to have an emphasis of matter paragraph that basically draws the user's attention to that footnote, to that uncertainty.
Great. And another question that we had sent in advance is, can a going concern consideration delay the issuance of the financial statements?
Yeah, so in my experience, it's usually when you're between outcome 2 and 3. So let's say that you have a plan in place, but you haven't got that signed agreement yet, but you know it's coming. Well, you might want to wait until that comes so that you can just have the disclosure and not that disclosure of uncertainty and emphasis of matter. So I've seen that hold up audits, to try to make them presented a little bit more favorably.
Okay, great. Oh, we have another polling question. Does your organization have a formal reserve policy? And somebody, when people were asking, sending in questions, somebody specifically requested a template for a reserve policy. So Lexi has uploaded just a generic template into the chat. So feel free to download that and feel free to reach out if you have any questions about it.
And from a financial statement perspective, if you have a policy that's documented and you can actually disclose that in your footnotes saying, hey, management and the board have adopted a policy, this is our policy, and you kind of have those reserves separated in your financial statements, that looks really good. And it really highlights that you are taking these best practices. So I would definitely recommend drafting that policy and disclosing it in your financial statements.
And one thing, David, I know you always talk about, if they have policies, you're going to audit those policies, right?
Correct. Yeah. So, there's no requirement that you have to have a reserve policy in your financial statements, but if you do, we can't just report it. We have to verify that you're actually following the policy. So we will do some procedures on that.
Great. All right, so next slide. So who's going to see these financials?
Yeah. So you have a going concern disclosure. Like, what does that mean? Who sees it? Well, it lives in your financial statements. So anyone that has access to your financial statements, your financial statement users, they're gonna be keen to that uncertainty. And maybe you can talk about in your experience how that's affected organizations.
Sure, sure. So, I think that people hear the word going concern and they get very nervous about it. And I know, David, you've done a good job of saying it's not a death sentence, right? It's just that we're seeing indicators. But I will say that for clients that I've worked with, when they get the note in their financial statements, and especially if it's the third scenario where substantial doubt has not been alleviated, and so it's also in the opinion, that has had an adverse effect on getting more money from donors. I think that a lot of times donors see that and they start to question, well, should I still give money if this organization isn't going to be around? It can also impact your ability to get financing, to get loans. We always say, apply for a line of credit when you don't need it. So once you have a note like this, it makes it very difficult. So it's definitely not the end of the world. But you want to do what you can to try to mitigate it and try to not have that in your opinion for sure. And then here, we actually have gone through this pretty quickly. I'd love to open this up now to the audience and see if anybody has any questions about liquidity, reserves, or going concerns, or just if you'd like to share your experiences. And it doesn't even have to be just with David and me. We welcome the whole group to speak in this roundtable. So would anyone like to jump in? Meredith, yes.
Unmute. Good, good morning. So, if you don't get a formal audit, but you perhaps get like a review, would this be the going concern analysis be something that you could do as an additional service, or how would you have a client think about that?
So the going concern analysis is required by GAAP. So if you're
Mhm.
presenting your financial statements under generally accepted accounting principles, then both management and the auditor still have to do those considerations and evaluation, whether it's a review or an audit, because that disclosure is a requirement for the financial
Right.
statements.
Okay. So it's in the financial statements by default, it would be reviewed. It would be looked at.
Correct.
Okay. Not by the service line. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. Anyone else? Meredith and Joanne broke the ice. And, I did just want to follow up, Joanne, with my answer that I gave you earlier. When I said 90 days cash on hand, um, we really are talking about just actual cash in your bank account. So, and not in investments. So, of course, if you're a larger organization, you may have a large balance in your investments, which is great. The point of this is just having it super liquid so that you can pay those bills, those unexpected bills, quickly. I do see another question, David, coming through. Are we seeing an uptick in going concern disclosures in the audits performed by Han Group?
I think just not just the Han Group, just in the industry in general. It's just based on the financial state right now. Nonprofit organizations are under more financial pressure, and some of them are struggling more than others. I mean, a common example would be any of those organizations that relied heavily on government awards that got canceled. Well, now there's definitely some uncertainty there, and there probably will be a disclosure depending on their financial position at the time of the audit.
And I know last year when the changes with the government started happening, some organizations chose to delay their audits. Is that right? Or they kept them open longer just to try to evaluate what was happening for those subsequent events like we were talking about.
Yeah, I know I had a lot of clients that they just wanted to delay it for many reasons. They had outstanding receivables with the government. They didn't know if they were collectible or not, so they had to do that for their credit loss analysis, and they just didn't know how things were going to play out. So they wanted to have a little bit more a clearer picture of what was happening before they started the audit.
Right. Great question. Anyone else? Oh, Meredith's saying, where is the reserve template? So if you look in the chat, you'll see that we have the PowerPoint and also a sample operating reserve template. Well, I'll just talk about this slide here. So this is just kind of a summary of what we've been talking about. But I really do recommend that you work with your accountant, or if you are the accountant, that you put together a monthly dashboard. We're doing this more and more for our clients and finding that it's really resonating with the board because I think the old way was kind of, send the board financials monthly, sometimes quarterly, sometimes only annually. And then the makeup of the board, a lot of times it's maybe just one or two people on the board who are even really looking at the financials because the rest are like, oh, well, that's your job. And then you give them this financial packet and it takes a while to figure out, well, what should I really be focusing on? So I'd say over this last year or so, really been doing a lot more of the dashboards, pinpointing, just saying, here's what you really need to see. We're doing this financials and also the 990 as well, which we'll have a session about in May. What are the key components of your financials in your 990s? But I highly recommend it. We've gotten great feedback from our boards. Also, I think just board training is really valuable too, to show the board these are the areas that you should be looking at and what would it look like if it's a red flag, where do I need to be concerned? And like I said earlier, that budget that they approve, they know that budget pretty well. So that's a pretty easy one to see if there are variances. But also, on that statement of financial position, what should our reserves look like? Our cash on hand, our current ratio, and again, that max revenue concentration too, which would be in revenue, obviously.
Yeah, I think that's a really important one. So I think a lot of people do the budget to actual comparison, but are they actually looking for revenue concentrations? And we saw how much of an impact that was on a lot of organizations. And, sometimes you're going to have that, but knowing that it's there, then you're being proactive and you can kind of build it into your forecasting and plans. And you know how important that funder is. So I think that's really best practice is really making sure that when you're reporting to the board, are you identifying, hey, we do have a concentration with this donor or this revenue source and monitoring that throughout the year.
Yeah, and absolutely. And so I guess our big takeaways, obviously, know your real numbers. Um, Act before the auditors ask, obviously. We always do that. Okay, what are the auditors going to ask us this time? Also having that planning meeting with the auditors even before year end, right? Just to talk about any of the issues. And I like to tease David, but we don't have an adversarial relationship with our auditors. It should be a great relationship. They're not trying to trick you or do a gotcha moment. It really is, it should be a great working relationship. And then having that ongoing oversight, the monthly, the quarterly, the annual. All right, great. Well, we have a question from Karen. So, are you finding board members are now paying more attention to the financials and metrics than they were a few years ago? I will say absolutely. I think, and we've done some board trainings too, because there's definitely, sometimes boards can get too hands-on, right? They can jump in and try to do what management does. So there really is a fine line. So the board is there for governance. They shouldn't be doing management's role, but if they're jumping in, then that could mean that they've lost faith in what management's doing, or that maybe those roles just aren't clearly defined. So we've had a lot of great discussions actually with our boards over the last year. I think boards understand um, that they need to help. They understand that um, it is uncertain times right now, especially last year with the government funding, just the economy. Donor behavior has changed some, inflation, lots of reasons. So we've actually seen great results with many of our boards saying, okay, how do we help? What do we look at? And doing this dashboard and focusing on key areas has made a big impact. What about you, David? What are you seeing with the boards that you're talking to?
Yeah, I guess it all depends on the size of the board. So if you have a really big board, normally you're gonna maybe see a committee that's responsible for it. But I do see now maybe more people are more inclined to actually building that committee if they hadn't had one prior. Like, do we have someone that's responsible for doing a little bit more financial oversight? Are we building out our policies? So I am seeing a lot more finance audit committees kind of be developed.
That's great. And I think that there are a lot of tools for that. Oh, we have a polling question. What metric does your board review most regularly? What do you think it'll be, David? What's your guess?
I would say reserves. That's the hot topic that I see a lot.
Yeah, I think that that's what people are saying here too. And one thing that we didn't talk about with the reserves, because I know we were talking about liquidity and going concern, but we've had some interesting conversations with our clients that uh, were running really lean during the COVID times. So, they really didn't incur many expenses, but yet they were still lucky enough to continue to get contributions or memberships, sponsorships, whatever. And so their reserves have actually grown pretty big. And so we have some conversations with clients about, how big is too big? And that's a great question to have. And it really leads to, well, to figuring out where that sweet spot is, right? About how do I make sure that I'm good to run my operations, also that I have that rainy day fund to cover unexpected amounts, but then um, how do I decide how much that I need to reinvest back into the organization? Because donors don't want to see that you're just piling this money and never using it, right? They want to see that you are continuing to invest in the organization, run your programs, um, do your mission. So it's been a really interesting conversation. We definitely say, start with your strategic plan and start looking at what's going on with your business operations. But have you had talks like that, David, with your clients?
Yeah, I mean, especially right now, because the financial markets are doing great the last couple of weeks. So, boards are usually lean to be conservative. So they're starting to talk about, hey, should we be investing in treasuries or CDs, something a little bit more stable than the stock market? And I kind of come back to, does your organization have an investment policy as well? Because you should have that. If you do have investments, you should be outlining, what you're going to invest in, what percentage should go first in stocks versus bonds versus something a little bit more conservative. So really outlining that. And I think a lot of good investment advisors will help you build that policy that they think's good for your organization.
Yeah, I found them being very helpful with that too. All right, well, I think we have about 5 minutes left. So if anybody wants to just unmute yourself, turn your camera on, talk about anything, you're welcome to, or if you'd like to continue to ask questions in the chat, we're happy to take those questions as well. And there is a final polling question. I see Deep is on here. Deep is our senior tax manager. I wonder, Deep, if you see anything that we've talked about that would impact the 990. I know the 990 asks about the policies that we have.
Oh, hi. Hi, Heather. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Hi, Deep.
Hi. Yeah, so the 990 itself doesn't really um ask about the policies. But typically there is a question on the checklist section of the 990 that asks if you've had greater than a decrease in 25% of net assets. So and in most cases, if you do, you have to report that on Schedule N of the 990, and then you just explain why you had a decrease in net assets. Most of the time, it's usually just organizations investing in their programs.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And Heather, I'll just add, it's not really related to this topic, but just kind of, I think you mentioned earlier is having that relationship with the auditor. I mean, I know we always encourage our clients, don't wait till the audit to reach out. We should be communicating throughout the year. If you have questions on things, concerns, you really want that to be a partnership and not just, a one-time service. So if you're not getting that service from your auditor, you should try to create that relationship that you're getting communication year round.
That's a great point. And I will say one of the roundtables we did last year, we had a couple bankers on, and they made the same comment too, that organizations really should get to know their bankers and to develop those relationships so that if there are hard times, that you've already built that relationship and then that banker can try to help you more as opposed to if you're coming in brand new and they don't know you.
And I think one of the takeaways that I got is when you said like about the line of credit, apply for it when you don't need it. So I mean, that's really good advice. If when I'm going through audits, I'm going to start looking, hey, do they have a line of credit? Well, maybe they should apply just so they have it kind of as an extra reserve. So that might be an audit recommendation that UCI give if they don't have line of credits.
Great, great. And I think we have just a few minutes. David, I'm going to put you on the spot, but for anybody who's a 12/31 year end going through audit right now, do you have any other type of a tip or anything that you would feel would be helpful for them to know or prepare for?
Um, I guess when it comes to auditing, I mean, hopefully that your practices in place already have you kind of prepared throughout the year. I always encourage people like, you should be preparing for your audit year round. So if you get a grant agreement, are you filing it, organized, marking it up? So hopefully if you have policies like that in place, then the audit's really not that heavy of a lift. And if you do feel like your audit is a heavy lift and it's kind of taking away your whole department, then maybe you need to kind of reevaluate how you're preparing for the audit throughout the year. Because there's some clients that are really prepared and it's like an audit goes by pretty quick because they're thinking about it in their processes throughout the year.
I will say I have one of my clients on here and she is so prepared. Their auditors always start early. It's funny. So, because everything's uploaded, so they just start the audit. But that's a great sign that they're ready. All right, well, I think that we've hit, well, maybe we have to talk for 3 more minutes to hit the 50-minute mark for the CPE. But once we close this down, if you would like CPE, please just keep your browser open and then fill out the short survey. And then Lexi from our office will send out CPE certificates. And we really appreciate all of you joining us today. I hope you found it valuable. And if there are other topics that you would like us to address going forward, please feel free to share. We always love to hear about what you'd like to hear about. And we'll do another roundtable discussion in June. Right, David?
Yep, absolutely.
All right.